Order, order. Welcome to this public evidence session of the Education Select Committee. This is the third evidence session in our inquiry on the early years. And before I invite our witnesses this morning to introduce yourselves to us, I'd just like to say a couple of things about the session that we're having today. So we know as a committee what parents and carers also know, which is that right across the country there are early years practitioners who do a fantastic job every single day to provide safe, secure, nurturing care for the youngest children in early years settings, and we pay tribute to them. We also have been, as a committee, really alarmed by the number of cases that we've seen going through the courts in recent months that have involved the most horrific abuse of children in early years settings, where parents and carers have entrusted their precious young children into the care of an early years setting, and they have faced unimaginable trauma as a consequence of doing so. So we are holding this session today to look specifically at the safeguarding frameworks and arrangements that sit around the early years, and to explore with you whether there are any changes that are needed to prevent the kinds of cases that we have seen going through the courts in recent months from happening to other families. We are doing that knowing that there are a couple of cases at the moment that are still in the judicial process, and that they fall within the sub judice rules, which means that we cannot refer to them directly in any way that could prejudice the proceedings of the court. So we would ask for your help and cooperation in doing that. But there is much that we can draw on from other cases that have already concluded, and from the themes that arise that give rise to the concerns that we have about some of the safeguarding practices and processes in the early years, and the important question of how we keep the youngest children safe. So that is what we are here to do today. Before we begin our questioning, can I invite all of our witnesses to introduce yourselves to us, please, starting with Clare Roberts.
Hi, I'm Clare Roberts. I'm founder and chief exec of Kids Planet Nursery Group. I started the company 18 years ago when my oldest daughter was a baby. I now look after 271 nurseries across England and Wales. And I also represent the National Partnership of Early Learning and Childcare, which is 10 of the largest group providers who are helping to support on strategy in the early years long term.
Thank you. Clare Reid.
Hi, my name's Clare Reid and I'm Children's Services Director for the Early Years Alliance. So I'm responsible directly for our portfolio of settings, but also the Early Years Alliance is one of the largest representative organisations for the early years sector.
Thank you. Mike Short.
Hi, I'm Mike Short. I'm the head of education at UNISON, the trade union. We represent around 50,000 early years workers, but also several hundred Ofsted inspectors working in early years settings.
Thank you. Jayne.
Good morning, everyone. My name's Jayne Coward. I'm Deputy Director for Early Years Regulatory Policy and Practice in Ofsted. So my responsibilities are around the effective regulation of childcare providers across England.
Thank you. Anne Graham.
Good morning. My name's Anne Graham. I'm here as the Vice President for the Association of Directors of Children's Services. My day job is as Director of Children's Services for the London Borough of Haringey.
Thank you very much indeed. I'll begin our questioning with an open question for each of you to answer. Would you agree that there is an operational gap between the statutory safeguarding framework and day-to-day practice in some early years settings? And from the perspective of your organisation, we have different perspectives at the table. What action is your organisation doing to close any gap? And we might start with you, Clare Roberts, if that's okay.
Yeah, of course. So obviously there is a risk that there could be a gap in some settings. Obviously everything that we do within early years and within our settings is to close that gap every day. And it's through speaking as a large provider. It's by training, your policies, your procedures, your inductions, and everything that you do in terms of supporting your colleagues every single day. We also recognise that it is more challenging for smaller providers or childminders to do the things that we're able to do in terms of being a large organisation, and that poses some of the challenges for some of them in how they can operate day to day.
Thank you. Clare, Reid?
We talk constantly within our settings about having a culture of safeguarding, and that's absolutely essential. You have the regulations, but it's actually what happens day to day in the settings that is vital. With our members, we offer a wide range of safeguarding training, and we constantly talk and share, make sure that they're aware of any regulatory changes, but also have access to the support that they need.
Yes, I think there is a gap. We're a trade union, so we're not a provider, obviously. One of the main things we do is we represent our members. We provide a voice for them, especially those who perhaps don't feel able to speak up for themselves. They're in restricted jobs and so on. We spend a lot of time campaigning for and working with employers to improve the quality of training, because that's a big issue, not just the quality of training, but the actual availability of training, and campaigning for there to be proper funding for that training and for early years in general, because there isn't enough. It's another important thing I think we do is that we provide a way for early years workers to feel safe when they're whistleblowing about concerns. I think that's quite an isolating, lonely position to be in, and so being in a trade union is an important part of being able to speak up.
Thank you.
Thanks. I think from our work in Ofsted, we'd say the overwhelming majority of those early years settings out there are safe and delivered by, passionate early years worker that want to absolutely deliver for the best for the children in their care. But obviously, as a regulator, Ofsted have a key role to play, and we know from our evidence that where it works well, it relies on those systems working together, having that open and honest safeguarding culture that Clare referenced before, and about those staff being vigilant and being the voice for those children, particularly those youngest children who can't speak for themselves. As you know, the DfE sets the minimum requirements. They're set out in the EYFS, and we're charged with inspecting and regulating against those standards. So in terms of our role, we're there to drive that quality, to ensure that continuous improvement, and we do that through identifying strengths, absolutely, in what we see, but also identifying those areas where practice falls below those requirements. And then we have a range of regulatory powers that we can use where practice falls below those expected standards, so raising actions, issuing welfare requirements notices, or suspending or cancelling providers in the most severe of cases. And I also think in terms of what we can do in those situations where there is a gap, we have a real role and responsibility to use our insights and our evidence to work closely with DfE, who, as I say, set those requirements, and absolutely we use that evidence and that analysis that we have to drive improvements to strengthen the EYFS. And some of the requirements that we saw that were changed in September 2025 in the EYFS came from that advice and collaborative working with DfE. So there's a real role for us there to use our insights and work with DfE where we identify that there are patterns or areas where we might want to strengthen that.
Thank you. Angro.
Thank you. I want to pick up on where you started, that there are many in the sector who do a good job every day. I think that the standards and regulations are there. I think that it requires scrutiny and consistency and oversight and vigilance to make sure that everybody's following that guidance as closely as they can. And that can only be done with consistent oversight, scrutiny through all means on a daily basis in each of the settings. I think that there is training there. It would be helpful if some of that was more routine, so that we can be sure that people are receiving regular training, even though that's a reminder. But I do, and we have learning processes, so when sadly things don't go as we would like them to, there is a learning culture that we need to keep going. I think a gap could be that if there is an incident that happens somewhere in one part of the country, gathering the learning quickly for another part might not be as strong as it could be. That might just be routinely left to the individual. Thank you.
I've got a couple of questions about the process of vetting staff to work in early years settings. So there are inconsistencies at the moment in the DBS and barred list requirements across different types of early years provider. Would you agree that the highest level of criminal record and barred list checking should be applied universally across all settings? I don't know, Jayne, do you want to
Yes, I mean, in terms of staff suitability, we're obviously charged with one of our key functions is around the registration and ensuring the suitability of nominated individuals, committee members, and with domestic childcare, childminders, etc., all those that live and work in the house that are age 16 and above. So the law absolutely states that everybody needs to have that DBS check, and we would like to see that be made mandatory through the disclosure and barring service, because at the moment we're relying on the DBS is only as good as the day it's printed, and then we're relying on that self-notification when something changes in a person's life, and I think it would close that gap and give more security if that signing up to the checking service was mandatory. I appreciate that there is a cost that comes along with that, but I think it would strengthen that DBS checking process, because those providers would get that up-to-date information.
Anyone else want to come in?
I think the most important part is that the DBS is only the first layer, and as Jayne touched on, a DBS is only useful if it's actually identifying someone that has done something wrong, and actually we need to make sure that providers are all clear that that's the baseline that you start with, and it's your ongoing monitoring, mentoring, observations, and all those things that happen practically within settings every day that are fundamental to protect children. And I think that's a really important thing for everyone to remember.
Yes, it's vital to have that robust starting point in terms of the recruitment and selection of candidates, but then it's the ongoing training, supervision and observation of those candidates that is important. And like you said, the whistleblowing and making sure that staff are supported to do that.
Just to add that it is a spot check in time, and that I think the sector has to be not rely on that as a comfort. It is a spot check in time. We know that when we speak with the police, should there be, say, a Section 47 strategy meeting, that there might be other information, that soft information that the police hold that isn't available through a DBS. And so I think we just need to know that it is one tool. It's not a comfort blanket. We still need to be sure that we watch, monitor the culture, and are vigilant all the time.
Yeah. And as you said, Claire, the DBS is there to monitor and check people who already have got a conviction, but in any of the cases that we can all think of that have been in the media in recent months, that the offender didn't previously have a conviction. So I want to ask about the process of taking up references, and whether you think it would be helpful if there was more obligation on that process and more of perhaps a kind of equivalent of a duty of candour on previous employers who are providing references to disclose whether there has been any cause for concern about a person's suitability to work with small children at that stage. In some of the cases that we can think of that have been in the media in recent weeks, the perpetrator had a long history of working in a variety of different settings, and one can imagine that it is completely possible that other colleagues in previous settings may have had concerns about that individual. There isn't currently any obligation on an employer providing a reference to disclose that at the point of applying for a new job, and we wonder whether there might be helpful changes that could be made in relation to referencing, and welcome your thoughts on that.
I think people are frightened of giving references, which is absolutely ridiculous, and they should be totally transparent. We ask, obviously, on every reference, are there any safeguarding concerns about an individual, and lots of people do come forward and share concerns, and obviously that's your job to explore, but I think there should be something that's done more widely to make people not be frightened to share those concerns and to be confident speaking up, because that's the only way we have an open culture on safeguarding.
And what would that look like? That what would give people confidence that if they were candid in a reference, there wouldn't be any comeback?
People worry that they're going to be sued for these things, and that someone's going to take them to court and say, actually, you felt like if you had low-level concerns about someone, you should be confident in being able to speak up about those things. But I think, obviously, the way the law stands at the moment, some people are apprehensive about doing that, when actually, if we want to put children first, that's what we should be doing in these situations.
Thank you. Anyone else want to come in yet?
To come in on what Claire said, I think safeguarding is everybody's business, isn't it? And it takes that clear information sharing to enable us to keep children safe, and we need to keep that in the forefront of our minds, that it's about the safety and well-being of children. So we welcome the strengthening of some of the reference stuff in the EYFS in September, but absolutely we need to make sure we put the children front and centre, and that relies on a community to do that, from all of us working together.
Thank you.
Can I add that I think that we would all welcome a strengthening of reference taking. However, we know that one of the reasons it doesn't work more openly is because people have been falsely accused, that there's opinion and judgment about an individual, there may be a personality clash or something like that. So I think we should be mindful of those instances, and of course we are mindful all the time about disproportionality and how some of these things play out in practice, and those are some of the reasons behind a closing down of reference taking, not just in this sector but across the field, really. Thank you.
Anyone else? In which case we'll go to Manuela. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I just, before I go to my question about identifying these safeguarding issues, can I just ask the panel how confident you are in the ability of large multi-site chain nurseries with maybe 100, 200, 300 sites to effectively monitor and implement safeguarding policies? Clare.
Obviously, as a large group provider, I would say, how is that any different to being a single setting? Leaders have responsibility. When we started, I had one nursery. So our managers have responsibilities in equal measures.
So if you allow me, you would have had a bespoke safeguarding policy for that setting.
Yes, okay.
Yeah.
So obviously we work across 70 local authorities, and there are different safeguarding thresholds for each of those local authorities. So as an organisation, we go with the lowest common denominator rather than having to adapt policies for each different local authority. We make sure that our threshold covers the lowest level. Does that make sense? So that we are all clear what we're doing. Because as a group operator, if everyone had different safeguarding policies, that wouldn't work and wouldn't be effective. But it means that we can make sure that we're monitoring. As a group, what makes it easier is we have resource to monitor, spot check, do all those things on a larger scale level, that being a single setting provider, you're the only person that sits with. So actually we have the benefit of a head office team who are able to monitor and make sure that all the things are being done correctly all the time. And we have our own internal training team as an organisation, so we're able to invest in that training, be it online, be it face-to-face, in a different way that for a single setting, it used to be that local authorities had the resource and ability to provide a lot more of that training. Certainly 18 years ago that was the case, and that isn't the case anymore. So what we've looked to do as an organisation is, as some of those supports have gone, we've implemented them ourselves as we've scaled.
Okay, thank you.
I think one of the challenges is that local authorities have different thresholds for safeguarding. They have different language in terms of what they call their processes, and that can make it very difficult for staff because you'll have a member of staff who's saying, oh, well, in my area that wouldn't meet the threshold, and another member of staff in another area saying, well, actually, I think that is something we should refer. So it does make it quite challenging for people on the ground to know what the expectations are, and I would agree about the training. In the past, the local authority would offer free safeguarding training, and it would be very clear that was a requirement, and I don't think it's a lack of willingness by providers to attend that training, but practically it can be very difficult to get on the training, and I think it should be available and a requirement that people are able to attend at a low, if no cost to the provider.
Thank you. Would you say that there is a genuine culture of reporting within earlier settings where staff at all levels feel confident that safeguarding concerns will be taken seriously and acted upon? And what evidence do you have that staff feel listened to when they raise issues? And I will start with Mike, please.
If I may, can I make a couple of comments on the previous question
before
I lose it as well, actually? Because, I mean, there are some elements of what we've got two Clare R's to the left. So what the first Clare said around the real issues with the lack of capacity in local authorities to drive that training. But I think there is also an issue in the private sector emanating from low-paying conditions. So we see something like a 16% turnover of staff compared to much lower in maintained settings. So I think there's an obvious problem there with training, because the more turnover of staff, the more training needs to be provided. So if the training isn't there, so it becomes a bigger problem, I think, in the private sector. So just wanted to mention that before. I'm really sorry. Would you mind repeating the?
Yeah. So would you say that there is a genuine culture of reporting within earlier settings where staff at all levels feel confident that safeguarding concerns will be taken seriously and acted upon? So especially what evidence do you have, if any, that staff feel listened to when they raise issues?
The picture is mixed, and we carried out a survey of our members in early years settings recently. It was at the beginning of this year, and one of the things we asked was, if you had a safeguarding concern regarding the conduct of a colleague or a manager, would you feel comfortable raising it? Some of the comments, just to give you a flavour, one person said, not without a union, I think it's a union member, I think they mean union rep next to me, as any meeting with senior leaders is often 2 or 3. Others saying there's a lack of sort of structure, trustees and chairs to speak to, and others feeling that it wouldn't always be taken seriously. And there is a concern with, low pay as well. Apologies, I'll probably keep going back to that with low pay and the lack of job security. People do feel vulnerable about raising things if it's not going to be taken seriously. They're still there, they've raised it, they're going to feel unsettled by that, and that's quite common among our members based on the responses to our survey.
Thank you. Anyone else on the panel? Yes, Jayne?
So, absolutely. In terms of the notifications that we receive from providers or about providers, we've certainly seen an increase in those notifications. I think we had around 21,000 notifications into Ofsted in 2023-2024 reporting year, and certainly an increasing number of that are from staff, which would indicate that there is some confidence there in reporting that. But again, going back to what we said before, we're absolutely part of a wider system that's designed to make those early year settings safe. So, like say, things that can build staff confidence to do that are really important. And going back to something that Claire said about, we can do the safeguarding training, but then it's also looking at the impact of that on the ground. So staff can tell you all they've learnt in training, but the actual putting that into practice in terms of confidence is something else, I think, to be mindful of.
I think, sorry.
Thank you. I just want to come to the point of training and the local authority providing training. I think we're living in a context now where we know that local authorities are short of money, and from where I sit, that isn't going to improve anytime soon. And so I think we do need the private sector to take account of training for their staff. Of course, if there is free training available, then that we would want to share that out, but I don't think that the local authority is going to be have the resources that it had that were referred to earlier in years to come. And so, safeguarding is everybody's business, and that includes employing staff and being sure that staff are properly trained. It's not what we want. We would want to be able to provide training for all, but the money isn't there.
I think the most important thing is that obviously that people know the different channels to be able to report their concerns. In our organisation, we have flowcharts available in every single room for all the team members, and that has the contact details of myself, our COO, all our childcare directors across the business, as well as knowing who the DSLs are within their settings. And I think it's making channels available that people feel able to speak up and to recognise that safeguarding is part of your culture and your DNA, because that's ultimately what it should be in early years. I think the other thing is as well, obviously as a growing group, we acquire many settings that are single settings or smaller groups, and I'm sure Jayne could comment on the number of notifications that our organisation makes to Ofsted on a weekly basis, that actually some of the settings that we acquire might never have made referrals. Now, my experience is we all live in the real world and things always happen in any business, and it doesn't mean that anything's gone wrong, but your duty is there to follow what your legal responsibility is. So I think sometimes we have to look at as well, does everyone understand and not feel that there's going to be ramifications for raising those concerns and speaking up? But we also have anonymous channels so that colleagues are able to, if they felt for whatever reason really uncomfortable, we encourage them obviously to speak up first and them to recognise that. But it's about providing different channels to make sure that they can do that in a safe space.
I think, sorry.
Claire.
If you look at the data for the local authority designated officers, who are the people that we would report a concern about a member of staff, the number of referrals to them has increased, and this isn't just specific to early years, but has increased by 40% recently. So I do think there is a culture of reporting, but what we do find is when we make those referrals, there's a different response from different LADOs as to what they accept in terms of their threshold. And I think it would be really useful to draw some of that data together nationally to really look at what the picture is, just to make sure that we are on board with that. And I do think there is a concern for settings that if they make a notification to Ofsted or to the LADO, what will be the repercussions of that. So I think probably some more knowledge raising about what happens as a next step to that, because if you are a provider that has never made a referral, that can seem like an enormous thing rather than an opportunity to share your concerns and discuss with another professional about what the next steps could be.
I totally agree with Claire. I think that's a really important point, that there is a fear, I think, sometimes of making that notification in terms of what the next step might be for you as a provider, speaking from an Ofsted perspective. So we have done some blogs to try and allay those fears and demystify the process, but I think that's an important point.
Peter.
I'll just quickly say that, just to declare that I'm a member of UNISON. Jayne, we just heard how important it is that providers are notifying safeguarding concerns, because that signifies that they take safeguarding seriously. Does Ofsted track and look into any providers where there are no safeguarding flags being raised? Is that a warning sign for you that something needs to be looked into?
We have various systems to track notifications and what those tell us, but I think there's more we could do in that space in terms of providers where we haven't had any notifications. I think we approach our work on a risk-based proportionate basis, so it's a matter for resource that where we know something is going wrong, or we potentially suspect something's going wrong. Those are the providers that we go out to visit, but I absolutely think it's important for us to look at where we don't get any notifications as well.
Yeah, I would guess I would gently say that you know something's going wrong when you're not getting any notifications, because as we've just heard, quite rightly pointed out, things always happen, and safeguarding is not about preventing stuff happening, it's about stepping in when something does happen.
Yeah, no, I totally accept what Claire says, and I think that it's an absolutely good point. And when we go out and do our inspections, we're absolutely looking there at understanding of safeguarding, and that's including conversations about things that might have happened within the setting, whether they've been notified to Ofsted. So absolutely, as part of our inspection methodology, it's something we'll look at when we're there on inspection. Similarly, if we're going out to do regulatory visits, those are questions and so on that inspectors would take into account. But I think if we're stepping back and looking more holistically, routinely, maybe there's more we could do to look at those providers where we don't get any notifications.
Thank you. Adwella, you wanted to comment?
Yeah, thank you. So my question is for Mike and Clare. Reid. Clare, you can come in. You've already answered part of this question. What mechanisms exist to protect staff from feeling intimidated or discouraged when reporting concerns, when whistleblowing, and how well do these work in practice?
Well, the first thing is having a decent policy and procedure in place. I know that sounds obvious, but lots of employers don't have that. So an effective whistleblowing policy, which has been negotiated with a recognised trade union, gives rise to a second point, which is in a lot of employers there isn't a recognised trade union. There might be some workers who are a member of a trade union, but having a recognised union is really important. It's an important way from our point of view for members to have a voice, but I think more importantly in this context it's an important way for staff to feel secure and protected. it's obviously only part of it, and I'm not trying to suggest that the process of looking after staff should be sort of outsourced from the employer to the trade union, but it enables us to work with the employer to ensure that sort of culture is there. It's not easy to change cultures in organisations where people feel afraid. I think sort of listening to staff and working together is probably the nub of it, to be honest.
Thank you. Clare?
I think it goes back to having that culture of safeguarding as to whether staff feel confident to raise things. You can have very strong policies and procedures, and absolutely they are your starting point, but unless staff feel that they're going to be supported when they make a disclosure, they're going to be very reluctant to do so. So it's really important that that leadership within a setting is really closely scrutinised in terms of when we're inspected, to make sure that that culture is there and is present in the setting, because staff often may well choose to leave rather than making a disclosure if they feel that that is going to be to their detriment, particularly when they're going to be looking for other work in other settings.
I think it's really important though that all colleagues know that it's their duty of care to raise and whistle-blow safeguarding concerns in rooms, in settings, because obviously managers can monitor and do lots of things, but they are the eyes and ears in that room, and we make sure that all our team are fully aware that the responsibility lies with them just as much as it does with us as leaders, to make sure we're supporting them. But I think that's where you have to have a culture of safeguarding that everyone gets and understands that you're going to do the best thing all the time. And actually, I'd rather people brought things up all the time that were utter nonsense, but you've got a whole open culture there, and that's what it should be, and no one should ever be made to feel as though what they've said is not valid, because of course it is.
I do think there were changes within the early years foundation stage to sort of draw attention to whistleblowing, but I'm not sure that was promoted quite as much as the other changes, so I do think there is the possibility there could be some more work around that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Jayne?
Final point as well, I think, because as an organisation we're not in settings all the time, then that notification and confidence of staff to notify is really important as well.
Thank you. Serena?
Thank you. I'll open this, I'll ask this question to Clare Reid and then open it up to the panel. Could you walk the committee through how information about safeguarding concerns is currently shared between early years providers, health services, local authorities and safeguarding partners? And in practice, who initiates information sharing and what does that process look like on the front line?
I think early years is in a really important role in terms of safeguarding, and often being the people that see children on a daily basis that nobody else sees. So it's really important that our staff are confident to make referrals and have those relationships with health. And I think through our training we are, but sadly one of the things that we have to talk to our colleagues about is remember that you are just as important as that social worker. You are just as knowledgeable as that health professional, because sometimes we don't always feel that our information is given as much credence as perhaps other professionals, and that's really sad. And we also find that if a child is already known to children's services, for example, they might start our setting, but we're not automatically notified. So we only find out when we speak to the parent, and if the parent tells us, and I have to say that's a real frustration, because actually that's an opportunity lost. If a child is already known to children's services or a health professional has a concern, for that not to be shared with us creates a gap within the system. So I do think it's quite challenging, and often we will work closely with health to support us in our referrals to children's services to give us a little bit more credibility to what we're saying. And indeed, when we have phoned children's services, I can think of a situation recently where we were concerned about a child who had previously been on child protection, had suddenly stopped coming to our setting, and we couldn't find out where they were. So we sought advice, and we got the response, they're not at school, they don't have to come to nursery. And that's really difficult, because not only does it undermine the professionalism of my colleagues, it makes the children less safe.
I I think the challenge is that there are real inconsistencies across certain LADOs within local authorities, and we've had situations where things absolutely would meet our threshold and we've been told it doesn't meet theirs. And it's like it should be much clearer what a threshold is. And actually, we've had some where they've said, you shouldn't be contacting us, it's your job to make those decisions. But is an open culture of safeguarding not what we all want? And actually there should be no deterrent, because obviously for us, we've got an organisation around our settings that can support that. But if you're a single setting and you've referred something and you've been told you don't know your responsibility, what are you going to do next time?
It really does dent that confidence. And I think the support services that are around, so for the early help services, that has greatly reduced, and that puts an awful lot of pressure on our early years staff. So for example, one of my team was told, well, if you're worried, you go and do a home visit. Well, you know, that's a really difficult position to be put in, and with the additional support around housing, debt, everything else, we're being asked to do so much, and there is only so much that we can do.
Just to add on that, yeah, I mean, Claire's point about the different thresholds in different services and different local authorities I think is really well made, and a lot of that is down to pressure on resources. So we've seen local authorities basically raising thresholds for those understandable resource reasons, but there needs to be a solution to that. We know that multi-agency settings from our members, they say they're reduced and overstretched, and it goes back to Claire's original point. Early years staff as a result often aren't treated as kind of equal safeguarding partners, and that's the way they feel about that, and a lot of it does come back down to local authority resources.
Okay, thank you.
I think that what I'm hearing here across the table leads me to say that you have to build a relationship with your LADO or LADOs. People might say that that's what they've done, but if you have a concern about a child, then you call your LADO or you call your safeguarding lead or you call the local authority and you build a relationship with them. In the local authority that I'm in, we have an open telephone line so people can regularly call that line. And we have a LADO who's been there for a long time, and she's not alone. Being a LADO is one of those roles where people tend to stay because they enjoy it. They're not running out to safeguard children at the beginning or end of the day. They've got a regular job. I would encourage everybody to make sure that they build relationships with the local authority. And if they're very concerned, then they write in and complain. I've known nurseries that have complained to the local, where parents have complained to the local authority, and they also complain to Ofsted. And there's an obligation on the local authority then to look into that situation. As we have repeatedly said around this table, safeguarding is everyone's duty. There is always going to be an issue about threshold. Sometimes in the local authority, we receive calls, information that actually don't meet threshold. But there will be times... But when there is a safeguarding concern, the local authority has an obligation through statutory guidance to respond. We will always be able to talk about the consistency of threshold, but I wouldn't want people around this room to think that that isn't something that that local authorities are not inspected on. I've recently been through an inspection, and thresholds is one of the things they always look at. Sorry, I think you want to come in.
Yeah, no, if that's okay. So with your ADCS hat on, so do you recognise what Claire Roberts has said is, I've got settings all across the country. A staff member in a setting in Haringey might phone up the LADO about a cause for concern and get one response. A staff member in a setting in another part of the country might phone the LADO and about an identical set of circumstances and get a completely different response. Do you recognise that practice is inconsistent across different local authorities, and that might be a problem, particularly for settings that are operating in multiple different local authority areas?
The way I see it is it's like a bell curve. There'll be a point which everything, is a concern. But in the margins, if a child hasn't turned up today, that might not be something that a local authority will respond to. But in another local authority with a different case and a different set of contexts, where the local authority might be known to a child might have been subject to a child protection plan, or there might be issues that the local authority are aware of.
With respect, that was exactly the example that was quoted, was a child on a child protection plan, nursery worker got in touch with the Lado because they hadn't seen that child for a while, and local authority said that's nothing to do with us. That would seem to be both a practice that's inconsistent and
previously been on a child protection plan, so they've recently been stepped down.
But that would seem to meet anybody's threshold for like reasonable cause.
And so therefore that's in working together, and that's an expectation. But if the child has recently been stepped down, it's really hard to talk about the scenarios and individuals. But basically, local authorities are mandated, and it's statutory guidance to respond. There shouldn't be such wide variation that a child at risk is not seen. However, on the margins, there might be there might be that variation. I hope I've made that clear.
Yeah, thank you.
And I would just like to follow up on the chair's point. So, based on your experience and insights, what changes would make that difference with the different systems, the inconsistencies with thresholds? So what are the important changes that will bring consistency and confidence back into the early years sector? Open that up. Anne?
I go back to the start that local authority, nursery workers and local authorities work with hundreds of thousands of children. And so I would say that when there's a concern about a child, that does meet, there is consistency there, and I would invite I'm seeing nods. However, there will be small variation, I put it that way, where depending on the individual circumstances, I wouldn't want people to feel that they're not to have confidence. I suppose it's, we are talking about systems that might be. It's really hard to say. It's really hard because we are talking about people working with people, and so. I think it's on the margins, but I think that if a child is at risk, every local authority should respond, and we are inspected regularly by Ofsted, and Ofsted scrutinise, having just come out of an inspection, the scrutiny is deep into child protection practices within local authorities.
Okay then, Jayne.
Okay for me to come in, and I absolutely hear what you're saying there, and I think. Because we do reflect when terrible things happen, and we do look at reflect on our own practice as well. And I think the lessons from our reviews, which won't surprise anybody here, that show we have that strong collaboration, we have that timely information sharing, and we're able to knit all those threads together. Then we have a safer safeguarding culture that sits around those most vulnerable children. I think there is work to do around some of that cross-boundary information sharing when things go across kind of a national picture. When we're working with the police, for example, sometimes we struggle to get information from local police forces without a disclosure application, or some forces look for a fee for that, which while we ultimately get that information, that sometimes leads to a delay in us getting that additional information that can help us. So I think, as we've said all along, that open and honest safeguarding culture and those key partners working together effectively. And it talks in, as you all know, working together, keeping children safe in education, that we shouldn't be fearful as statutory partners and organisations working together about sharing that information. But I think sometimes myths or concerns around that data protection or sharing of information can sometimes blur the line. So anything we can do, I think, to give that confidence and promote that child's at the heart of this, we need to share that information. And we all see bits of the puzzle, but unless we work together, we don't actually see that whole picture, and I think that's really important.
I think the most important part is that there's consistency. I do have to say that the majority of LADOs and local authorities are great, but there are situations, and obviously when you cover as many local authorities as I do, you know that there are some that are maybe not as helpful or as knowledgeable, and at times question, do you know your responsibility, which I absolutely do and our team do, and that's where you sort of feel it's really difficult for providers if it's not that consistent approach with the advice and support that they're getting. And for many single setting providers, they're a manager, they might be working in ratio as well. They do need support from that expert, and that's what's there to support them. But I think there has to be a consistent approach. And we've shared some of the examples with Ofsted to help support them with some of the challenges that we've faced, because obviously with the number of settings and children that we do have more experience.
I'd agree, it is that consistency of approach, and also being able to be notified directly if a child does have an allocated social worker. Just to be given that information would be just, it seems nonsensical that they're not really.
And did you want to come back in?
If a child is subject to a plan, then all the people in that, all the professionals in that plan are part of working with that plan. So I don't understand the scenario that's been put forward in that situation. If a child is subject to a child protection plan and they are attending a nursery on a daily basis, the social worker has to speak with the nursery to find out how the child is doing. The parent will also be dropping off, picking up, and so absolutely the nursery should know who the social worker is. I think that there are also, you can complain, people can complain to the local authority, and there are processes for escalation. And so if you find, so you can escalate in that process. I don't think anyone should sit back and be passive about something like that. I'm not suggesting there's passivity, but we have to all be, children are at the heart of everything we do. Safeguarding is everyone's responsibility. And so you build that relationship and ask why. Thank you.
Do you accept that local authorities have got a responsibility not only to the individual child and the circumstances around an individual child and a concern that's being raised, but also to foster a culture within which early years professionals are confident to come forward, and that should be something that LADOs actively reflect on when they're approached by nurseries, that nobody should feel that they have done the wrong thing by raising a concern, even if that concern doesn't meet the threshold for further action.
100%, I agree with you entirely. If somebody's referred information and it hasn't met a threshold, then there should be a discussion about why that is, and always encouragement to come back if things change. So that qualitative relationship between one professional and another is really important. I don't think any LADO in the country, I'm hoping that LADOs in the country feel that they're fostering poor relationships, because we know that good relationship and strong communication is a critical factor in keeping children safe.
Thank you. Serena.
So in December, the Secretary of State announced that she will be appointing an expert panel to inform guidance for the sector and effective and safe use of digital devices and CCTV in relation to better safeguarding practices. But in your opinion, how will that balance against staff accountability, children's privacy and parental confidence? So I will open that up to Clare.
Okay, so I can only speak for us at Kids Planet. We have CCTV in all of our settings and have done for 18 years. And when we acquire any settings, we implement that and put that in place. I'm not saying that CCTV equally is the be-all answer to all safeguarding, but I sit there with two hats regarding this. One is obviously to protect children, but also it's to protect colleagues, and there can be misunderstandings that can support them, and see the CCTV being present in settings is a clear way of hopefully giving a true picture of what's going on. For us, it's a significant investment. It's an ongoing investment. It's not just a one-off cost that you then put in place. You need adequate funding within our sector to be able to do that. And as a larger group, that's what we're able to do. But I totally understand why many settings haven't got the resources to put that in place, because it's got ongoing maintenance costs, it's got ongoing support, IT infrastructure surrounding it. It is easier to do when you're in a larger organisation than when you're a single setting that might be a pack away setting as well.
Thank you.
I think, sorry, really mixed views across the sector, really real concerns about things like cybersecurity, privacy of children, but also the diverse range within early years. So, for example, childminders, we have settings that are forest school based, so do not have a building that the children go back to. So some real questions about how would it work, and knowing that CCTV can absolutely support staff, can support investigations, but it hasn't been found to prevent some of the horrendous issues that we've seen. So I think it's just something that needs to be looked at really, really carefully.
Mike?
Agree with that entirely. I mean, our members have got very mixed views on this. I mean, there are obvious benefits it can bring to safeguarding, aren't there? You can see what's happened. And actually, another sort of lesser benefit, but still important benefit, is that from our members' point of view, if there's an allegation is made which is completely false, then it's a way of showing that it's completely false, didn't happen. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, it can bring its own safeguarding concerns, misuse of the footage, if you like, risks of hacking, not something I know much about, but you can see how that could happen, and then you've got footage of children which could be misused, obviously, as aside from the more, if you like, day-to-day issues around privacy that you alluded to in your question, which are really real as well. So I think that is important, and there is a concern. It's a lesser concern than safeguarding, but there is a concern around micromanagement as well, the misuse being used against staff. To be honest, ultimately, as Claire said, it's not a preventative measure. It's potentially helpful with the right safeguards in place, but it's no substitute for training and those sorts of things to prevent things happening in the first place.
Yes. Well, Jayne and Anne, if I could ask you a different, a follow-up question, which is your views on the potential merits of introducing a national reporting and escalation mechanism for safeguarding concerns in early years settings. So, what are your views regarding that?
Can I just come on the
CCTV?
Just to say that I think the quality of the equipment that's installed is important, because on too many occasions the quality of CCT has let people down, so it's another false sense of security. Also, CCTV, even in an indoor facility, doesn't cover everywhere, and people, including in schools, know where the CCT doesn't reach, and that those are the hidden places that people need to be aware of. So we come back again to the leadership and the quality of management scrutiny and oversight that we've mentioned before. Well, I'll hand over.
I'll say similarly around CCTV. I think it is a complex topic, and there's a wide-ranging views around that. And again, we want to think about the impact on children, because that's the most important thing around this. So obviously it will be a decision for DFE in terms of introducing mandatory CCTV, and our role within that will then be determined once that decision's been made. We don't routinely look at CCTV, as I'm sure panel members know now, and our inspectors aren't investigators, so they're on site for a day to look at what it's like for a child to be in that setting during the day. But we're absolutely welcoming the opportunity to collaborate and work alongside DFE as part of the expert panel that's just been announced recently. Sorry, could you repeat the second bit of your question?
It was about the national... Oh, I can't find it now. It was about introducing a national reporting and escalation mechanism.
Or notifications.
Yes. If that's not something that you're behind the detail, that's absolutely fine. Okay, I'll leave that.
To not be behind the detail.
Okay, that's fine.
So this is an idea that some of the parents who've been directly affected by abuse, their children have been abused in nurseries, are calling for, which would be a national mechanism for both staff within nurseries and parents and carers to report concerns, such that there could be an overview of clusters of concerns being raised about a particular setting. So you might have a threshold where lots of lower level concerns triggered an additional inspection or investigation. you might have a situation where a single concern above a certain threshold triggered an investigation. But I think this is coming from, so the important thing I think for both ADCS and Ofsted to reflect on, it's coming from a lack of confidence on the part of parents in the existing processes for raising concerns that there are.
Is that not what Ofsted does?
I was going to say, in every setting we advertise, and I'm sure it's part of the requirements that we advertise that parents can talk to Ofsted directly if they've got a concern, and certainly that's a poster in every single setting.
And without referring to specific cases, if you're a parent and your child's been abused at a nursery that's been rated good by Ofsted, you might understand why parents don't have confidence in those processes at the moment and are therefore calling for something else. Yeah.
So I think it'll be interesting to look at that and find out more about that, because we currently hold information about all settings on a database, and if we receive a concern about a provider, we will look at that concern alongside the other information that we hold, and that might be other notifications that we had or regulatory events or inspections where we've gone out before. But absolutely, as part of our learning reviews where things tragically have gone wrong, we need to reflect on those processes and systems.
Can you explain why you would then get a situation where, and we'll talk in the abstract, but where concerns have been raised with Ofsted and no action is taken, or the inspection goes ahead as normal and concludes that that setting is a good place for children to be?
So I can explain kind of the risk assessment process, if that's helpful, when information comes in, which might give some of that answer. So when a notification comes into us, there is a risk assessment. It comes into our department. There is a risk assessment that is done on that information. So we'll take into account the information that we hold already about that provider or individual setting to make a decision about whether it's for Ofsted, because some things that come in on for us around fees and that type of thing. If it's a lower level concern, the risk assessment might be that we consider that at the next inspection, or where we feel that there is potentially a breach of requirements, or the registered provider isn't meeting requirements, or the children may not be safe in that setting, then it would be referred to region for them to go out and visit. That might be a telephone regulatory event, that might be going out to visit the setting unannounced, or it might be bringing forward an inspection so that we can go out to assure ourselves that that setting is still compliant with those regulations.
Sorry, I'll let Anna answer and then bring Peter in.
Yes, just to say, I'm not familiar with the new detail that's been proposed, and sight of that would be helpful. But I'm mindful that people move from site to site, and so their poor practices, their abuse of children may not be located in one setting or one chain of settings. However, that doesn't move away from the proposal that's been suggested by parents. I absolutely understand that, and I've heard what Ofsted do. Local authorities will do something similar. If you're hearing concerns or complaints from a particular setting, that heightens concern, and there could be an intervention following that.
Peter.
To what extent do limited resources, limited capacity guide the decision of what to do when a safeguarding concern is raised with you? So you mentioned, for example, phone calls. Obviously, that can be very useful. It's also has limits. Are you confident that you have the appropriate resources and capacity to respond appropriately to every concern raised with Ofsted?
I think the decisions that we make in terms of whether we go out and do a visit or make a telephone regulatory event are based on the risk to children, not on the resource that we have available, because the children are the most important thing. We absolutely would make sure that we put the children first in the decisions that we were making. There's always opportunity to reflect, I think, and we absolutely do through our internal learning reviews. I think as practice evolves, we need to make sure that our systems and processes are as robust and effective as they can be, and that takes us as a reflective organisation to look at where things could be strengthened or changed, and some of that absolutely is about resource as well. But you'll know that DFE funding Ofsted to increase the frequency of our inspections. So we'll be moving from 6 to 4 years and going out to do our initial inspection within 18 months of registration, and there'll be additional resource in place to enable us to do that. But I think we absolutely have to reflect on where things don't go right and make sure that we strengthen our response and our processes and our systems in accordance with that.
Can I just touch on, so I obviously know as a large group how many notifications we make, how many accidents occur in our nurseries, how many serious complaints come in. We have a weekly meeting called Triage that as senior leaders we sit on, where all of those things are discussed. So I think Ofsted do use that information. The average unannounced the percentage of unannounced inspections that took place last year was 16% across the sector. At Kids Planet, and I know that we do a lot more notifications than most, we had 42% unannounced inspections. So definitely there is a correlation between the risk assessment being done over what notifications are coming through. And I know that, and I know that the notifications we make trigger unannounced inspections, but obviously I sit there with the confidence to think that that's fine, and as an organisation that's okay. But I think for others they might be more nervous with the fact that they know that that's what's likely to happen, in fairness.
Well, just to go back to a previous answer that you gave, in some ways that's the wrong way around. If you're an organisation that's taking safeguarding seriously and making lots of notifications, it's fantastic that Ofsted is responding to that, but perhaps they should be...
But where are the people then that don't make any notifications?
Exactly.
Yeah, totally, exactly, yeah, and I agree totally with you. It's fine, and I welcome unannounced inspections as much as announced, but I think for some people that's where they would be nervous then. No, I'm agreeing with you, I'm not disagreeing. Sorry.
So if I could just pick up something you've said there, Jayne. So you have a 4-yearly inspection routine for nurseries. And Claire's saying that if she raises lots of safeguarding concerns, that Ofsted will come and do an unannounced inspection. What is the process if you're getting notifications from parents who are concerned about a nursery setting? How long would it take Ofsted to respond to them and go and do an unannounced inspection? And what's the threshold if you're getting phone calls from parents who are concerned about a setting? Does it work the same way?
So we get around 21,500 notifications a year, which we triage. Going out and doing an unannounced inspection is one option that we can do, and usually if the inspection is due within the next 12 months, we'd go out or kind of bring the inspection forward, if you like, but go out and do that inspection. But we have other regulatory powers available to us. We don't always have to go out and do a full inspection. We can just go out and do a regulatory visit and focus specifically on the concern, the notification that's been brought to us. But we do have timelines for responding to notifications. I can give you the exact details. I can send that to you separately, but if we say that something requires urgent regional action, then the region need to take some action within 24 hours of them receiving that notification, and we track that through our kind of internal oversight procedures, if you like, to make sure that we are doing what we say we're going to do, and we are getting out to those settings as quickly as we can. So, and where it isn't an urgent regional action, then it's within a week of us receiving that information. So our approach is risk-based. I absolutely take your point about where there aren't any notifications, and it is a balance between where we potentially know there is a risk of harm because somebody's telling us that, to where we're not aware that there's something. And absolutely we have a finite response, finite resource, number of people that we can send out to do things. And our early years regulatory inspectors and our senior officers work incredibly hard, and there's lots of processes and systems in place to make sure we have that quality oversight, that the right decisions are made, that we take that proportionate action, that we're risk assessing effectively. And currently we're looking at those risk assessment processes to look at where we can strengthen things, and looking at that kind of resourcing issue that sits around that as well, as I hope you would expect us to as a reflective organisation, particularly in light of some of the really horrific cases that we've had recently.
Thank you. Caroline.
Thank you. So I'd like to move on now to talk about workforce, and we know that in some areas, perhaps more than others, it's difficult to recruit enough qualified, high quality staff, and I'd like to just look at how this impacts on robust safeguarding of children. So to what extent do you think reliance on temporary and agency staff in the early years sector affects the continuity of relationships with children, the relationships between staff and children, and their safeguarding practice? So we'll maybe start with you, Clare.
Yeah, so I think it totally affects it. We don't use agency colleagues across our organisation. The reason why we don't is because, for me, staff are the most important resource that we have in terms of children and having the best experiences. I sit on a recruitment call every day along with our senior leadership team, where we talk about priorities in terms of vacancies across our organisation. We talk about needs and how we support them. Our central support team were early years leaders or educators previously, so they understand deployment grids, ratios, etc., and are able to support our nurseries. We have our own supply teams who choose to work as supply workers, and because we're a group, we're able to cluster colleagues who move around to support our nurseries. That is what being the benefit of a larger organisation enables us to do. If I was a single setting, I wouldn't be able to do that. Yeah. But obviously I come from the place of having worked as a manager in a single setting and having had an organisation that's scaled up. So I understand what's best for the children and actually what's best for the colleagues working in the room. Because if you bring people in who don't know your policies, don't know your procedures, don't know the children, how is that going to be the best experience for the children you're looking after? How is that going to be the best environment for children to flourish and meet those important milestones?
Thank you. Clare?
I would agree, it makes it much harder, because in terms of that training, that culture, being able to whistle blow, that takes knowing your colleagues, but also if you remember that we are looking after our youngest children that are the most vulnerable and often not verbal. So it's really knowing those children really well, their cues, their ways of communicating, to be able to pick up those concerns. So that being able to tune into the children is absolutely vital. And if you're new to the setting, with the best will in the world, you won't know that child as well. So it does create a lot of challenges.
Thank you. Any views, Mike?
Yeah, you'd think, wouldn't you? I mean, absolutely agree with what's been said. I mean, it's probably worth, I start by saying, this is no criticism of people who choose for legitimate reasons to take on that sort of temporary worker role, the sort of supply, that kind of thing. But for the workplace, for the employer and the safeguarding culture, the general workplace culture, actually, it's much more difficult if you've got higher turnover of staff. And there is really high turnover of staff in early years, particularly in the private sector. It does make it much more difficult to get the right culture in place. It also, I mean, it's hard to effectively and regularly train staff, because that sort of relationship with the supervisor and manager, you can't really develop it if the people are coming and going. But also it just means you have to provide more training, because there's more people to train. So it's more of a resource issue as well for safeguarding. I think I can't really answer that question without talking a bit about pay as well. I mean, this early years sector is really, really low paid. I mean, in our last survey, 1 in 9 of our members who work in early years said they've relied on a food bank in the previous 12 months. So there's a really strong incentive for people to leave the sector, especially if it's a difficult place to work. It's rewarding but difficult. The pay's low. You know, for a lot of people, it's a case of I can earn more working in Sainsbury's or something like that. And again, no criticism of that as a job, but in terms of developing the right workplace culture, training people and getting people working together and feeling confident in the policies and procedures, as Clare said, it's much more difficult when we're in a low-paid sector.
It's quite a lot of responsibility for such a low-paid job.
Absolutely.
Enormous.
Mm-hmm. And the stress that comes with that as well, and that's another thing. It's not just I'm not paid enough, I'm going to leave. It's not the combination of the low pay and the responsibility causes a lot of stress, and for a lot of people there's a shelf life to how long you can carry on doing.
Yeah. I think as well it's benefits as well. You look at other organisations and often you find that people in early years only get the minimum statutory annual leave entitlement, which it's a really demanding job. You have to work incredibly hard, and for us one of the things that we do as an organisation is invest in our benefits to support colleagues, and we went to colleagues to ask them what they wanted us to invest in order to be able to strengthen that offering for them, because you do need to have rest time away from work, and having more than the sort of minimum 20 days a year is absolutely important.
And when you Sorry, I was going to say, when you talk to colleagues, that safeguarding culture is a key reason that they stay. Having just written lots of letters thanking people for 20 years service, when people feel that they're in the right place, it is the best job in the world.
We'll come to you now.
Sticking with workforce, we've understandably focused on the things that are going poorly. I mean, 11% of people going to food banks, that's pretty frightening. But are there any examples of good practice in the sector? Can you give us any evidence of where it's going well? And if you can't give us any evidence of that, what does best practice look like in early years recruitment?
So I think what I talked to you about there earlier on, about the fact that we're focusing on it every day. It's really easy to sit and moan about the lack of qualified early years educators out there. And I think obviously there's previous things that happened to do with GCSEs, requirements and things like that. It certainly didn't help our sector. But we have our own training academy. And so rather than saying, oh, right, we can't find early years qualified workforce out there, we home grow our own talent. So out of a workforce of 8,000, we have about 1,000 learners who work across the business. And they range from more mature workers who want a change in career, but it's providing those opportunities of people who might have skills and experience in other sectors and have had their own children perhaps that want to come in and work within early years. But I think the other thing is making sure that colleagues feel supported, looking that you're making sure you're investing in the benefits that I'm talking about, because I have to keep stressing that it is easier as you become a larger business to do some of these things. When I think back to 18 years ago when I was on my own running a nursery, it is much harder when you've got a lot of other things to do day to day. So we're able to invest in our central support team, to have a people team, to have a recruitment team, to have an internal training team, to have a training academy. There is not enough investment for single settings and for individuals in our sector to be able to do all those things. And I, for me, the two things that are most important are safeguarding and quality, and that's why we do and invest in the things that we do in our business.
Any other contributions on that one? Yes, please.
Yeah, just we did a blog around some of our evidence from our inspections back in 2024 around that high turnover and the impact that had, and reflected a lot of what's said here about some of the difficulties that might bring in terms of high staff turnover, a lack of opportunity to get to know children really well, inconsistency in the key person system, because that's so important, isn't it, in terms of settling children and getting that information sharing with parents, but also senior staff having to step into ratios as well and the impact that might have. But in terms of mitigating that risk, we did see some good practice, as Clare has described there, in terms of prioritising training so that new and temporary staff get particularly a focus on safeguarding training when they arrive as well. So there are settings out there who are mitigating that risk well, but that doesn't get away from the fact that, you know, we don't want that high turnover of staff and having to mitigate against that. We want that quality where children are safe and protected.
And as I said, as I've recently been sending out thank you letters for people that have been with us over 20 years, there are staff that are really committed, and we do have a lot of staff that are really highly qualified, who have got degrees, who are early years professionals, so have gone far above the level 3, and they're really committed to working with those children. What saddens me is that we're not able to reflect that commitment with a higher salary band, particularly for those staff that really have worked with us for a long time or have completed degrees and things like that. So we do often lose people as they move further into education to other roles as well.
Understood. I was just going to say a very similar thing, that it's not really an example of good practice, but just the level of commitment and dedication to the provision, but also the safeguarding element of it from both our members in early year settings, but also those inspecting early year settings who work for Ofsted. It's really exemplary.
Fantastic to hear. Please.
I don't want to overshare, but I know it's from personal experience one of the best jobs that you can do. You are working directly with children and families and your colleagues, and you are helping children to grow in their early years. I can't imagine, I look back to my early career with great fondness. So there are a set of ingredients that make a unit, a setting, brilliant. And it's brilliance that we want for all our children. And, it is staffing stability, it is longevity, it is confidence and trust in your in your managers and those you're working with, and it is an environment where children are just banging on the door to get in, you know, and sometimes they're reluctant to go home. And also parents talk to each other, and so you know those units that are incredibly popular. Safeguarding, even in those settings, is critical to remain focused on. I do think that there is an issue about high turnover, not just use of agency workers, but you know where it's not working well, there are indicators there too. Very low pay, high turnover, a critical and harsh environment, you know, not a lot for children to do, parents unhappy. So we need to watch out for those units too, because we talked about consistency earlier on in this discussion. There is consistency of service delivery, I think, that could be out there, and we need to watch out for it.
I think the thing is professionalising the sector though, and it's giving people those pathways to recognise there are lots of jobs out there that you can do that as a 17, 18-year-old when you leave school, no one has any idea what they want to do. But sometimes they need a nurturing arm around them to recognise that they can progress in any organisation. And I think it's giving people that ability to recognise that they can work their way up through different positions within early years. Our greatest examples are people who are now leaders within our organisations that left school at 16 and went into early years. And I think that's really important, that you give hope to the future generation of workers by giving them the clear ability to recognise what they can do.
Brilliant. Time's so short, so I'll leave it there, Chair.
Thank you very much, Caroline.
Thank you. I'd just like a quick follow-up on recruitment, and it is a little bit of the elephant in the room. If you don't want to answer, that's absolutely fine. But the Department for Education is describing steps it's taking to meet workforce challenges, including recruitment campaigns which are seeking to attract more men into the sector. Given some of the horrific stories we've heard recently about what's been going on in nurseries, how comfortable do you feel about welcoming more men into the sector?
I think we have to be mindful that just because a handful of men do something that's inappropriate, we can't make a decision to say that having men in early years is not the right thing to do. I think the wider point is around the culture of organisations and recruiting the right people, and men have as much to offer as females do within the early years workforce, and for lots of children they might not have the opportunity for male role models, so it's important that they get a real balance of a mix of colleagues working across rooms.
Yeah, absolutely, we welcome men in early years, and I think it would be a really sad state of affairs if we moved away from that approach. Obviously you have to have the right recruitment, you have to have the right checks, but like Claire said, you know, a diversity within our workforce is really, really important.
Not much to add, but just to say the safeguarding right and the recruitment process is right, and if that's done, then the fact that arguably the majority of offenders and so on are men shouldn't matter, because they won't be employed in the first place.
Okay, thank you.
So just say to colleagues and witnesses, we are struggling with time at this point. So we've had an important discussion about lots of sensitive topics, but I need help from colleagues with kind of brief and the questions that are on the topics that we need to ask about, and answers that are as succinct as possible, if that's okay from our witnesses. Otherwise we will struggle to get through everything that we want to by 12 o'clock. Thanks.
So I have a very quick question about ratios, which changed in 23. How do current staff-to-child ratios in early years settings, how do you think that they support or potentially undermine safeguarding and supervision? Has it made it harder?
For me to go first. So in terms of ratios, I think the problem with ratios is obviously ratios are there as something that you have to follow. The reality of children is children are unique and individual. You don't wake up the day after your 4th birthday and say, oh brilliant, I can go on a 1:30 ratio suddenly rather than a 1:8 the day before. So I think it's about knowing your children. I think obviously you're referring to the change in the 2-year-olds ratios from 1:4 to 1:5. We operate in the norm at 1:4. As the academic year goes on, the reality of children and how ready they are to move to a 1:5 ratio depends on those children and depends on where they sit within that room. So it's about knowing your children and doing the best for them, and that's how we view it.
I think where it does become a challenge is inevitably our funding is based on those ratios. So if nationally we're being told that a 1:5 ratio is okay for a 2-year-old, I totally accept that it's very different for a child that's just turned 2 compared to a child that's almost 3. But then we also have children with very diverse stages of development. But where the funding is linked, it makes it more difficult to sit at having those higher ratios. So I do think that does cause an issue.
Okay.
Yeah, our members think it's problematic. We were opposed to the change at the time. We think it increases the risk to child safety. I mean, it's increasing staff workload, going back to my earlier point around workloads and stress and so on, so there's a problem there. And just one other thing to mention in this context is if you have a child or a number of children who need one-to-one support, perhaps they have SEND, then that the ratio basically becomes even higher than 1 in 5 in practice if some children are getting one-to-one, absolutely right. So that's really difficult. I know there's research from Nottingham Trent and University of Northampton saying that the ratio 1:5 just doesn't work. We would agree with that.
I'll just say, I mean, obviously DfE is responsible for setting of the ratio requirements, but just to remind that they are minimum requirements, but you put that against a backdrop of increasing financial pressure as well on settings. But I think the absolutely key role there is knowing the children, and when we go out to inspect these settings or regulate these settings, the question is what it's like for a child here and how are we ensured that the provider is meeting the needs of all the children who are there, and that's really important.
Just to say absolutely, and children need to be risk assessed to know that they're getting the support that they need, and ratios should then follow. It would be great if the ratios followed the child rather than the minimum being the standard. There are children with additional needs that has been mentioned that, you know, need that additional support. Thank you.
Serena.
Thank you. My question is about intimate care tasks, and some argue that such tasks should always be carried out by 2 members of staff. So what are your views on that, and also the reality of the practice behind that? And I'll start off with Clare.
Okay, so in an ideal world, of course, that would be best practice. But just being practical, it's all about how the configuration of your environment is and things like that. If nappy changing or toilet facilities are directly off rooms, it's much easier to ensure that colleagues are never on their own. But the reality is this is not a sector that's funded in a way that enables there always to be 2 people present during intimate care times. And I think it's about protecting children. It's about making sure that colleagues, where possible, do this. But it isn't always possible. That's just, unfortunately, a fact within our sector at the moment.
I think it is about taking a sensible approach, absolutely having changing areas that are, you know, visible but maintain the child's dignity as well. So particularly at change time, that's a really important learning opportunity for a child. It's part of their routine, it's part of their care, it's part of their nurture. To have 2 people there is actually quite difficult for that child. So it's thinking about how we do that in a safe way so that people aren't able to go off for long periods of time unobserved, out of sight or hearing, absolutely not. But you can do it in a way that doesn't require there to be 2 people there at all times.
Okay, thank you. Mike?
Not to repeat what's been said, but just to say there's an interaction between sort of 2-on-1 intimate care and the ratios we were just talking about, because if you're operating at the minimum staffing in terms of the ratio, you have 2 staff often doing intimate care. The ratio in practice for all the other children is much higher or lower. It just, it's more, yeah.
Jayne, has Ofsted a view?
That was just kind of just thinking about the balance really between the impact that would have then on the needs of the other children at the same time, and making sure the needs of the child are paramount in that as well.
Okay, and Anne?
I think if we're worried about the sexual abuse of children, having two adults present kind of makes sense to me. However, I understand the challenges that brings, but I think that's something that the sector needs to consider.
Okay.
Aaron?
So my question is specifically to Jayne Coward, and it's around where you've got safeguarding concerns that arise. How is it that Ofsted distinguishes between individual practitioner responsibility and then the provider taking accountability for that?
Yeah. So as you're aware at the moment, Ofsted's charged with the inspection of child provider at individual setting level. But when we do receive information that might suggest that a provider isn't meeting the requirements of registration, then as I said before, we will assess that against other information we hold about a provider, and that might be a group or an individual setting, depending on whether it is an individual setting or how they're registered. If we did have concerns about the nominated person and they oversaw more than one setting, then absolutely that would impact on the work that we did, or the action that we might take in relation to the other settings that sat under that group provider. It's a very complex world out there at the moment, and I think the landscape's changed in early years, so that's why we welcome working with the DFE to look at how we now look at multiple providers and how we register, inspect and regulate against that. So you'll know that we formally started conversations with DFE in January. It's something we've long asked for, but we've started formal conversations with DFE about what that might look like and whether that might need legislative change to make sure that what we're doing is the right thing and is the right thing for children.
You're confident that there is enough clarity in the assessment process to know whether you're dealing with an individual or whether you're dealing with a wider kind of provider or cultural point?
I think that's some of the conversations that we need to have from January in terms of what they're, because a group provider can look very different. There isn't one definition of what a group provider looks like in terms of how they're registered. So I think it's really important that we have those conversations now moving forward, so we get ourselves to a place where there is real clarity about our role in terms of registration and inspection and regulation of those multiple providers, working with the sector and also working with DFE so that we can get to the best place in terms of our role in that.
Okay.
Well,
Thank you, Chair. My question is for Jayne. How does Ofsted assess safeguarding culture rather than just compliance with statutory requirements and statutory processes?
Absolutely, and I think we've all agreed that having that open and positive safeguarding culture is so important. So again, panel will be aware that we recently published our renewed inspection framework back in November, and when thinking about the writing of that renewed inspection framework, we really wanted to make sure it was well aligned to the EYFS to enable us to regulate effectively through our inspection work. You'll also see, as part of the evaluation area in safeguarding, a focus on a focus on whether there is an open and honest safeguarding culture within those settings. So that's some of the things that we ask our inspectors to look at when they're out there. So when they're out in a setting, whether they're doing a regulatory visit or doing an inspection, then our inspectors are looking at what is it like for a child in that setting. That is about the open and honest safeguarding culture that we hope exists within that setting. That's about talking to leaders and then following up that with conversations with staff and looking at the impact that has on children. That is about understanding what training, including safeguarding training, staff might have had, but also what that's like in practice in terms of the impact of that. So not just that people have been on safeguarding courses, but that you can see that and that's displayed through the conversations that we have. So it's not like a compliance checklist. It does have a quality element to it, looking at the strength of that. If you look at the toolkit now, there is a section around what evidence inspectors look at to collect when we're out on our inspection, and that's in all the sections, so for all the evaluation areas. Whilst there is a safeguarding evaluation area itself, that's looking more around the child protection requirements, but you'll see that safeguarding is threaded through all parts of that inspection toolkit as well. So we're considering that in all aspects of a provision.
Thank you. And a follow-up question. So in light of recent horrific cases where there was a catastrophic lack of safeguarding culture, how does Ofsted ensure the lessons from serious incidents are embedded across the early years inspection system? And does Ofsted anticipate any change in light of these cases?
So, as I said, we absolutely are a reflective organisation, and we absolutely will go back and do a learning review to look at the process, the systems, what happened, particularly where things have gone wrong, so that we can look at how we change processes, strengthen process, do what we need to do to ensure that we're constantly learning and evolving and strengthening our practice. So some of the things that we have done are strengthening the renewed inspection framework. We've also disseminate that learning through our inspection workforce. So, for example, our inspectors got an additional 2 days training as part of the renewed inspection framework. Some of that focused specifically on babies, which was another real focus in the renewed inspection framework, safer eating and safer sleeping. So as we understand more around strengthening those practices, we need to feed that not only back through our frameworks but also back through our inspection workforce, and we also have a key role to play in terms of sharing that learning with the Department for Education as well. So we do meet with DFE's safeguarding team. We have an internal safeguarding audit that we feed back to DFE in terms of trends and patterns, research that we might be seeing, so that we can work with, advise where there might be further strengthening in the EYFS as well. And that's something that we need to constantly do. That's a continuous loop.
I mean, it sounds like you think everything's fine.
No, I think no. That's why I say we're
reflective.
I mean,
I think that there've been a series of serious cases where there is a very clear mismatch between what Ofsted has said about an institution and what has actually been happening inside that institution. And I don't think that parents listening to this evidence session will find that we are an organisation that's got a culture of learning and we are reflecting to be an adequate response to some of what they're reading in the media at the moment.
I apologise if that's how I came across. We absolutely don't think everything's fine. That's why we are reflecting on our practice and looking at what we can move forward to do. That's why we're working with DFE, why we want to be part of this expert panel looking at CCTV, while we've met with some parents who have been impacted by the horrific events that have happened in cases, so that we can listen to what people are telling us, so that we can absorb that internally and look at what extra we need to do in terms of what we do. We know we have a really key role to play in terms of ensuring settings are safe, that parents can drop their children off with absolute confidence at the beginning of the day. But we absolutely also recognise that we're one player in part of a community that needs to work together. But I apologise if I appear to be saying that everything was solved. Absolutely not. We know there's work to do, and we will continue to listen to what parents are telling us, what the sector are telling us. We work with our stakeholder groups to listen to what they're telling us, what our inspectors are telling us. It's really important that we do that.
Mark.
Thank you. I'm going to stick with you, Jayne, if that's okay. And we're going to speak in general terms about how Ofsted responds when complaints are made by parents or others that contradict a settings Ofsted rating. How does Ofsted respond to those complaints today?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. So we take seriously any complaint that's raised by a parent, police, local authority, whoever it comes into us, and then we do a risk assessment process on that, and we look at what we've been told against the information that we hold. And it's absolutely important that we take action where we believe that, or we're being told that practice isn't at the standard that would be expected. So we have that risk assessment process. If we feel that we need to go out and visit as part of a risk assessment process, we will then refer that case, that notification, to our regional early years team, who will then go out and depending on what the situation is, they might go out and carry out a regulatory visit, or they might decide to do a re-inspection, because obviously if we do a regulatory visit, the judgment as was, grade is now, that is sitting on that inspection report wouldn't change. So sometimes it's the right thing to do to go out and inspect. We also have the option to go unannounced or not announced. Yeah. I mean, we did stop the routine unannounced inspections back in 2015, which was around parity across the sector, across the different remits that we inspect. But again, that's one of the things that we are being asked to think about, or to have conversations with DFE about, around those no-notice inspections and where that threshold might sit.
How common is it that you get complaints about settings that have been rated, they're doing well, but you get complaints that contradict what their actual ratings are? How often does that happen?
So we get 21,000 notifications in our last reporting year that we published, and our last official statistics said that 98% of our settings were good or outstanding, so there often is a mismatch between a good setting and potentially a notification.
That's fine. And then just drilling down a little bit further, you talked about the safeguarding. No, you didn't. You talked about the risk assessments that you have to do, the process you have to follow when those complaints come in. Can you just talk a little bit more about those systems that are in place to review complaints that come in outside of the ordinary inspection cycle?
Yeah. So it's set out in our publications, but it comes into the applications registration and compliance team, and they will do a risk assessment looking at what their previous inspection history is, what are the notifications we might have had about that setting. At that point, we can choose to speak to the provider to get some more information, and our applications, our ARC team would do that. If we feel that there is a breach in requirements or with children are at risk of harm, then we would refer that into region, and then our regional teams would pick that up and do some more in-depth work, which usually involves speaking to the provider, doing a visit, doing an inspection.
Finally, just very briefly, how quickly does that take place when the complaint comes in?
So if something goes to, we have 24 hours to respond if it's a safeguarding concern in our applications team. If we assess that something is urgent regulatory action, then we need to respond within 24 hours. That doesn't necessarily mean going out to the provider, because obviously we work with other statutory partners as well, so that might be contacting the ladder, or it might be working with the police, or we'll go out within a week for a non-urgent regulatory. You might go out sooner, but up to that time, and we are held to account for those timescales through kind of our internal corporate systems.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Darren.
Thank you, Chair. Can I ask from the provider perspective what your views are on the role that Ofsted currently plays in ensuring accountability in the early years sector? So this will be for Mike, Clare and Clare. And in addition to your current views on it, are there any improvements that you think need to be made to the inspection or the regulatory processes in order to make Ofsted more effective from your perspective? Clare,
so in terms of Ofsted, obviously they've reformed how they're currently doing inspections. So in fairness, it is a recent change that obviously we haven't had as much experience of as we had done previously, but I think it feels more like it's a collaboration between provider and with Ofsted in terms of it's your day to talk about what you do and how your setting really is. I'm not sure it was always the case previously, or it certainly didn't feel like that all the time. I think one of the things for me, and I've touched on this before, is about notifications. We're really clear on what we need to notify, but at times, and because there are so many inspectors, they're not always clear on whether or not something needs to be notified or not. And we're left a bit as a provider in a situation where I know we are overnight notifying at the moment and will be causing Ofsted way more admin issues than we probably need to. But as a provider, the last thing I need when an inspection starts is a big debate over whether something should be notified or not. Because we all know in any organisation, you don't start off with the best foot forward if you're arguing over minor issues. So we've got a bit at the moment where we're over-reporting everything to covering ourselves, and that's because we've been told that any contact we make with any external agency by some inspectors needs to be shared with Ofsted, and until someone tells me what does or doesn't, that's exactly what I'll carry on doing across 270 nurseries. But I think obviously I know that that's what's happening on the ground because I have a wider understanding and picture of what's happening even in different geographical regions within Ofsted. But obviously we need Ofsted. Ofsted are there as a regulator, and I welcome them coming in and assessing as an additional support as to where our settings sit in terms of quality.
Do you think that clarity around to notify or not to notify and the thresholds of that is an improvement that could be made? Do you think that's a satisfactory situation going on?
So I would say that if I'm sat there unsure, that must be incredibly difficult for the single setting provider to know whether or not they should have done that or not done that. So whereas we're able to take a view as an organisation with a team that says, just report, and I can see people looking, thinking, why are you getting us to do this? But I'm getting them to do it because I want to do the right thing, and it sits ultimately as my responsibility, which I take incredibly seriously. But I think there could be much tighter strengthening and clarity for providers and for inspectors as well on what does need notifying and what doesn't.
Thank you. Mike?
I would agree with that. There needs to be much more clarity on what we need to report to Ofsted and what we don't. But also better understanding of what happens when a notification goes through, so that actually people do feel that it's a supportive process. I think the changes within the inspection framework, which allows much more of a professional dialogue, I think will enable people to share more about what's happening in their settings, but also Ofsted to be able to ask those more challenging questions, because it does feel that there's a slightly different approach to inspections that is being rolled out now.
I mean, it's just as I've said in my introductory remarks, we've got members in early years and also working as Ofsted inspectors. So from a provider perspective, we're coming at both, but actually what's interesting is that both groups really welcome inspection. Probably in terms of early years workers, they're more welcoming of it than members in schools and so on. Actually, I think there's a particular feeling among early years workers, our members in early years, that it's really welcome, and actually quite a high percentage in our surveys say we welcome more Ofsted inspection. I know a lot of our members have the feeling that there should be more ability to do those regulatory visits, and I take Jayne's point that can't lead to a change in the Ofsted grade. But where there's been a concern, I think it gives our members a chance to get in there more and really drill down into what's happening with safeguarding. The fact that in school inspections you have an additional inspector doing just that safeguarding stuff points to the importance of that in early years as well. And so that I think there is a strong case for more of those regulatory visits alongside the more routine inspection framework.
I think it's important to balance with the fact, though, that it's very easy for a colleague across your business or a parent who's unhappy about fees or something to complain to Ofsted, and they don't even have to identify themselves. So I think sometimes as well there can be concerns that are raised to Ofsted that aren't always genuine concerns, and obviously that's for Ofsted to look into those matters and decide what to address.
I think as well there's a really important differentiation between school inspections and early years inspections, because with schools, obviously I'm not saying a poor outcome is not good, but with an early years inspection there is a real critical factor for your business, in the sense that your early years funding can be withdrawn if you don't achieve the required standard, whereas in a school it doesn't work in quite the same way. So as a provider, that is a real risk for you if your inspection isn't good.
Thank you. And my next question is to Anne Graham around local authorities. Where does accountability for safeguarding in early years provisions sit within local authorities, and how is that accountability exercised in practice?
Yes. For safeguarding generally within the local authority, safeguarding sits with the chief exec of the council, and that usually sits with people who hold my role, Director of Children's Services. So my job is a single focus on children's services, and so I will inform and brief him, and I have regular contact with him. On the political side, we have the leader of the council, and we have the statutory lead member for children's services, and so the political accountability sits there. The four of us regularly I keep them informed. I have a large team of people, and so I keep them briefed regularly. We also have the safeguarding partner arrangements with the police, education services and health in particular, and the local authority, and we meet regularly, and data shared, information shared, including for early years, because it's all of children's services. So think that gives you sort of the structure, and we are all, safeguarding partners equally accountable for safeguarding arrangements on a day-to-day basis within the local authority. I take the lead on all those statutory arrangements.
Thank you. And do you think that there are improvements that are needed so that local authorities have the tools, they've got the capacity, they've got the authority they need to oversee and intervene where necessary in safeguarding matters within early years provision?
I think so. However, I think capacity is always an issue. I think that there's more that we could do with the private sector. I think that we in my local authority and many local authorities, training is offered. There's reach with the LADO. We've heard earlier in this discussion about consistency of those relationships. Now, is that because people are not building those relationships, or is it because LADOs are very busy? I think that would be something we could look into, but capacity does ease those issues. Training, we've heard. Who provides that, who pays for it, who funds it, and we come back to the rigour and the scrutiny of what happens in sites that are currently inspected once every 6 years. That's a long time. People can start and leave during that period, and it's moving to once in 4 years. We've heard that people welcome inspection, and we know that though inspection can be, I'm thinking of another word other than a pain and a burden, actually a focus is helpful.
Thank you.
Thank you, Manuela.
Thank you, Chair. And my question is for Anne. To what extent are LADOs and Director of Children's Services appropriately resourced? I mean, you mentioned the challenges that councils are facing in terms of funding. We mentioned a little bit the role of LADOs. It's not consistent. So what steps could be taken to improve public awareness of the two roles?
The public awareness of the LADO is critical. The LADO in my local authority does training, including for those in all sectors, the voluntary organisation, faith groups and so on. It would be really good if there was additional funding to have more LADOs because they could do more work. Workloads vary because the LADO is not just for the early years sector, the LADO is across all of the local authority. So yes, additional capacity it would be helpful. I don't see that it's going to be forthcoming, but yes, the more capacity we have, the more work we can do. And that would include promotion to parents too. We have access to websites, but there's much more you can do to to have awareness of LADOs. In terms of the role of the Director of Children's Services, I'm not sure that the public is familiar with the role of the Director of Children's Services. But people are aware of the ability to complain into the council, and I think that's probably the bit that needs highlighting, if it's not already highlighted.
Do you think an average parent of a child in an early years settings in Haringey knows what LADO stands for, who the LADO is and how to get hold of them? I don't know. With AI, people Google, who do I complain to in the local authority, and it might come up that way. 10 years ago, I'd have said no, because even those who say the word LADO may not know, what that stands for, but we do know what the LADO role is. It tends to be linked to professionals. So yes, there'd be more there we could do for public awareness. Yes.
Thank you. My next question is to Clare Reid, Mike Short and Claire Roberts. How clear and effective is your local authority's role in supporting quality assurance, accountability in early years provisions, and what specific improvements, if any, to local authority processes would make them more consistent, efficient and supportive of early year providers? Claire, do you want to go first?
Okay. So I think it's consistency again. I think obviously having a consistent approach, having consistent funding allocated to training support for providers is key. It is a bit like a postcode lottery. which obviously in an organisation that's large like ours, we're able to pick up some of the things that are missing. But if you are a single setting, you are unable to do that. So I think there needs to be consistency looking at what support's offered. And also, as I said earlier, lots and lots are absolutely amazing, but there are some where you are thinking, this is not real and is not how things should be.
Yeah, so because you have that kind of like wider view,
Yes.
and you work with countless local authorities,
Yes.
and you say some are quite brilliant, so you can see best practice.
100%. And there are some that invest in training and some that are able to support that, some that visit settings more regularly, some that are open to the fact that picking up the phone doesn't mean that you don't know your individual responsibility, but actually talking things through is sharing experiences and taking advice and guidance from an expert, whereas some would say, what are you phoning me for? I think obviously as well, obviously remember we have 271 settings, so for some local authorities we may have 10 nurseries that sit within that local authority, so they may think they speak to us a lot, but if we have 10 nurseries they should speak to us a lot, because do you know what I mean? It's so I think sometimes there's a perception of how many settings you might have in that local authority and why you're talking to them more regularly as well.
Okay, thank you. Claire?
I would agree. It's a very mixed picture across the country, and there's real differences between local authorities, and that does make it difficult in terms of the training that's available. But again, the focus is often on the settings that haven't had a positive Ofsted outcome. You'll get an awful lot of support at that point, but with the inspection cycle being quite long, there's not necessarily that noticing as if there's any change in practice, or if a setting isn't particularly, I think local authorities will know if a setting doesn't really engage in their training or their network meetings, but there's not necessarily anything that's done about that. So it does create gaps.
I agree. I mean, there's a massive variation in practice. Effective local authorities have teams of early years specialists who are well resourced, they're trained, they do regular quality checks, they're sort of proactive in that sense, I guess you'd say, and provide bespoke training, whereas there are others which don't have as much resource. As a result, they only provide support when they're pushed, perhaps by Ofsted. Our members find that often the people they need to speak to the local authority are too busy and so on. It's not a criticism of local authorities so much as it's a criticism of, the last time UNISON did research, which was last year, on the funding gap in local authorities, it was about £3 billion in England. It's the gap between the services they currently provide and the amount of money they expected to get in the next financial year. It's £4 billion across GB, about £3 billion in England. There's been some injection of investment in local government since then from the government, which is really welcome. But we're at the beginning of a process of sort of rebuilding services in local government at the moment, so it's a struggle, I would say.
And my next question is for Mike and Clare Reid. What evidence do providers collect to demonstrate compliance with safeguarding standards during inspection and ongoing self-evaluation? So what are those evidence documents that you look for when you have
the information we collect for inspection? In terms of what Ofsted ask us to provide, it's actually not a very high bar, and I think there was quite a shift within the inspection process to not make sure settings have to do too much paperwork essentially, but in terms of safeguarding we would always make sure that we recorded all the children's information, any concerns about children were recorded, and there's also quite a strong requirement in terms of when a child transitions to another setting. So, for example, when they move from nursery to school, that we're able to share that information and that concern in the right way.
I'm not sure I have anything I could add to the questions on the list.
So I'd say training records, safeguarding logs, incident reports, internal audits, risk registers, supervision records, CCTV review processes, safeguarding dashboards, flowcharts, leadership monitoring reports, and clear records of all concerns, complaints to be discussed.
Yeah, I mean, we have that data, but whether Ofsted ask us for it, I think, is a slightly different.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Jayne.
I think there's some mandatory documents that we would always ask about. Every inspection is individual, but you're right, we did move away from being more paper-based, and people would have their Ofsted file, and then inspectors would be in a room and not out, seeing the practice on the ground, interacting with staff, having those conversations, correlating what leaders told us with practice on the ground. So we might look at a variety of all that documentation as part of our inquiries and our conversations, but we have a narrower range of mandatory stuff, if that makes sense. That
Obviously we talk about how important high quality training is. So Claire says, she has evidence of that kind of training that's been implementing and outcome of that. So I would say that's something that maybe Ofsted would be interested in looking at.
We're absolutely interested in the training that has been done and the impact that has within the setting. Absolutely, that's really important and key. I think we're in probably a daycare setting for up to 6 hours and a childminders for half a day. So it's been really proportionate about what we're looking at and not overburdening the professionals that work in those settings, but making sure we really get underneath what it's like for a child in that setting. But I think it's really important that we do continue talking to kind of the organisations that sit around us, particularly stakeholder groups, Early Years Alliance, etc., so that we do hear those messages around consistency and how we can look at strengthening our practice where it needs to.
The local authority will also ask us about staff qualifications and training and things like that as part of their quality visits, as well as part of their funding requirements.
And that leads perfectly on to my question, which is for you, Anne, if that's all right. What specific challenges arise for local authorities when regulating or supporting large nursery chains around consistency, communication and accountability? We talked a bit about this from the other perspective earlier of large nursery chains working with lots of different local authorities, but from the perspective of a local authority, what are the challenges?
So if it's a large nursery chain such as the one we wouldn't have oversight of the entire nursery chain. We would have oversight of those that are in our areas. And then it was, as described, there are forums and fora that the local that the chains can, that the settings can attend. So we would take an overview of the quality of provision generally. If there was a concern, like say there were just 3 of, then we would use our teams. We have a team in Haringey who would work with that team and the larger provider too.
So we talked a bit earlier as well about trying to differentiate between a setting-specific safeguarding concern and something that might be more sort of across a chain. When an issue has been identified that there is concern might be a chain-wide issue, do you routinely let other local authorities know where that provider is present in those local authorities to be aware of it?
I think it would depend on the situation that had arisen, but I don't think that that's routine currently. I think in light of what we've heard recently in the recent cases, I think that that's something we need to consider strongly, so that we get that overview, because we know, that people can move around within a setting. If it comes to, I think it happens more regularly within the school chains, that because we know of the school chains and we know how they work more, and so we need to look at how we work well with those school chains and transpose that across to nursery chains. I think that's something we need to look at in light of recent cases.
And then, final question from me. Given the heightened safeguarding risks for children with SEND, who often require higher staffing ratios, specialist staff training, stable key person relationships and adapted safe environments, does the current funding model enable early years providers to meet those safeguarding responsibilities effectively? Claire, perhaps we start with you.
So I think obviously it depends on whether or not you're getting adequate support from local authorities to support children with needs. It is challenging depending on where you live, how quickly children can get the right support that's needed within the setting. And actually often it falls to the provider to put in place those additional ratios without the adequate funding.
And is that in part because of the time it takes and the difficulty of acquiring an EHCP, which is the funding mechanism?
Yeah.
We've heard elsewhere that it can feel for early years providers that they do all of the work to get the EHCP, and then the child is old enough to go to school. Yeah. It's great that they've got it, but too late for them.
And we've had situations where children have had one-to-one support in maintained nurseries, and for whatever reason it's not worked out in practice with that child in that setting, and the local authorities have asked us to take the child back without the one-to-one support. And I said, absolutely no chance, we would like the one-to-one support, which they gave us, because they obviously realised you can't put those kind of responsibilities if a child's unable to be kept in a maintained school nursery on a one-to-one support, you can't expect them to go back into a private provision without the adequate funding. So I think there needs to be a full look at what happens with where you live, how quickly you get the support. It is easier in a group, and I keep stressing this, where you've got resources to invest and to put those extra ratios in place. You cannot do that. It's an unsustainable sector to put that on single site providers with how it's currently funded.
So is the issue not so much the funding model, it's the speed at which providers are able to access that additional funding?
It's both.
Okay.
It's both, because I think some of the things are the speed of how you access it, some of it's where you live, how whether or not you'd get that funding in the first place. It's also quite an admin task to apply for funding. So we have a SEND support team who support our specific SEND in each local setting, which obviously not everyone has that either.
I was just thinking, I imagine a small independent individual provider is not going to have a support team.
Exactly. And the whole reason why we've got these things in place is to reduce some of that burden.
I think it goes before the EHCP process. We often very much focus on that, but when a young child comes into our setting, even if they've been promoted to come into our setting by, say, for example, a health visitor, etc., parent, we've got concerns about this child. In most local authorities, there's a requirement to do the plan, do, review, gathering that evidence before there's even a conversation as to whether there's any additional support. So even though a range of professionals have said, we think this child needs extra support, the nursery then still needs to go through essentially 3 cycles of observation, assessment, input to see if that funding is needed. And then in every local authority there will be different criteria. And again, I take on board what Claire's saying, but as a local provider, it is about developing that really good relationship with the local authority and being able to understand the mechanisms to secure that additional funding, but it is a real challenge. And again, we'll often have schools say we can't meet child's need, and the local authority say, well, nursery, you need to take the child back again. And we're like, well, that's really unfair.
Anne, we'd better hear from you.
I'm not familiar with that situation where a child is moved around according, if the child has needs, then the needs have to be met. So I'm not familiar with that situation. We know that the government is working on a SEND white paper and a schools white paper, and so because we know that the system doesn't act as quickly as it needs to, sometimes for children up and of different ages. One of the things I'm passionate about is speech and language for a child, and we know sometimes we get an ask for speech and language support. I don't know if that's our colleagues' experience, and actually when the child is in a nursery setting for a while, their speech and language picks up, and so that's probably part of the reason for the review and planning. But we know that the government's looking at a white paper to address the SEND system that we know is sometimes referred to as being broken.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That brings us to the end of this evidence session. We really appreciate you coming today to give us your evidence. If there is anything that you didn't feel you were able to get across in the time that we had available, or any additional detail or points of clarification that you'd like to make, please do feel free to write to the committee afterwards, and we'd very much welcome that. But for now, that brings our evidence session to an end. Order.
Thank you.